He fired the quietest worker on the site, thinking he was just another nobody. But what the boss didn't know was this: nobody owned the ground beneath his feet, and was about to take everything back. You won't believe how it all unraveled. It was a hot, dusty afternoon at the construction site. The sun beat down relentlessly on the workers, who moved with the rhythm of machines, hauling materials, hammering nails, and shouting instructions. Among them was James, a middle-aged black worker with a calm demeanor and strong hands that told stories of years of hard labor. He worked steadily, quietly, without complaint, even as others took short breaks to escape the heat. His fellow workers often wondered about him. He wasn't like the rest. There was a quiet confidence in him, as though the struggles he faced didn't weigh him down, but gave him strength. The site supervisor, a wiry man with a perpetually sour face, barked at everyone, but James seemed to attract his attention more than most. Perhaps it was because James never argued back, or because he wasn't the kind to cower. Today, however, the real storm came from the boss himself, Mr. Carter, the man in charge of the entire project. Dressed in a spotless white shirt and a hard hat that screamed authority, Carter stormed onto the site. His presence silenced the usual buzz of the workers. He looked furious, waving a clipboard in the air as he made his way toward James. "You," Carter shouted, pointing a finger at him, "do you have any idea what this mistake has cost us? Hours of work wasted? You think I pay you to mess up like this?" James straightened up slowly, the weight of his tools still in his hands. He glanced at the blueprint Carter shoved in front of him. It was a problem with the foundation measurements, but James hadn't been the one responsible. He opened his mouth to explain, but Carter didn't give him the chance. "Don't waste my time with excuses. You're nothing but dead weight here. If you can't do your job right, you're out." Carter's voice rang loud and sharp, echoing across the site. A few workers stopped what they were doing, their gazes darting nervously between James and the boss. James looked at Carter, his dark eyes calm yet unwavering. For a moment, it seemed as though he might argue, defend himself, but instead he simply nodded. "If that's what you think is best," he said quietly, his voice steady. There was no anger, no pleading, just an air of acceptance that seemed almost unsettling in its calmness. Carter scoffed. "Best decision I've made all week," he muttered as he turned away, waving dismissively at James. "Get your stuff and leave. I don't need slackers on my side." James didn't argue or plead his case. He set down his tools, wiped the sweat from his brow, and began gathering his things. The other workers exchanged glances, some looking sympathetic, others too afraid of Carter to intervene. As James walked towards the site gates, he paused briefly, turning to take one last look at the construction. His gaze lingered, not with bitterness, but with something deeper, something unreadable. "Good luck with your project," James said softly, almost to himself, before walking away. From the side office window, Carter watched him leave, shaking his head. "People like him," he muttered under his breath, "always think they deserve more than they're worth." As James walked down the dusty road, he pulled out his phone. He dialed a number and waited for the call to connect. "It's done," he said after a moment. His tone was calm, but there was a hint of something in his voice, something that hinted this wasn't the end, but only the beginning. James walked away from the construction site, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though he carried no weight from what had just happened. The dusty road stretched ahead of him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He didn't feel anger or shame. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction beneath his calm demeanor. The phone call he had made earlier lingered in his mind. The voice on the other end had responded with only 3 words. "We're ready, sir." That was all he needed to hear. Behind him, the chaos of the construction site resumed. Carter continued to bark orders, blaming the day's delays on James's supposed incompetence. Workers shuffled nervously, knowing better than to question him. Yet, a few of them couldn't shake the feeling that something about James's departure didn't sit right. They whispered among themselves during breaks, recounting how James had always done his work with precision and care. One younger worker, Eric, said what the others wouldn't. He didn't seem like the type to mess up. Something about the way he left. I don't know, man. It was weird. Carter, overhearing the comment, snapped back. Weird? What's weird is people thinking they can slack off and not face the consequences. Now get back to work. Meanwhile, James reached his truck, an older but well-maintained vehicle parked under the shade of a large oak tree near the side entrance. He climbed in, placed his tools carefully on the passenger seat, and sat still for a moment, staring at the sight in his rearview mirror. He allowed himself a small smile before starting the engine. As he drove away, his mind replayed Carter's words. "You're nothing but dead weight." He couldn't help but chuckle softly. If only Carter knew the truth. But James wasn't ready to reveal his hand just yet. Timing was everything, and he had learned the value of patience long ago. The land beneath that construction site held more history than anyone there could imagine, and James intended to honor it in a way Carter never would. His drive took him to the city courthouse, a grand old building with wide steps and an air of authority. James walked in with a folder tucked under his arm, nodding at the receptionist as he made his way to a private office. Inside, a lawyer, an older gentleman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile, stood to greet him. "Mr. Daniels," the lawyer said, shaking James's hand. "I take it everything went as expected?" James nodded. "Exactly as expected. He fired me right on schedule." The lawyer smirked, motioning for James to sit. "Then we're on track. The paperwork is solid, and the city officials are ready. Once they see the deed and title, there's nothing Carter or his investors can do." James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Let's wait a little longer. Let him dig himself deeper. I want him to think he's on top of the world before the ground falls out from under him." The lawyer raised an eyebrow but nodded in agreement. "Fair enough. Just let me know when you're ready to pull the trigger." James stood to leave, pausing at the door. "I've waited this long. A few more days won't hurt, but when the time comes," he said, his voice firm, "I want him to feel it." As James stepped out into the courthouse parking lot, the sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow over the city. He climbed back into his truck, feeling the weight of his family's legacy in the papers he carried. He knew the land wasn't just dirt and rocks, it was history, sacrifice, and resilience. Carter thought he was the king of his little kingdom, but he didn't realize the throne he sat on didn't belong to him. Not for long, anyway. Back at the construction site, Carter stood in his temporary office, a large, air-conditioned trailer filled with blueprints, charts, and the faint smell of stale coffee. He leaned over his desk, his fingers drumming impatiently on the surface. The project was already behind schedule, and the investors were breathing down his neck. They had put millions into this development, and Carter had promised them a quick turnaround with high profits. But every delay was another dent in his reputation. He picked up his phone and dialed one of his key investors, Mr. Howell, a sharp and calculating businessman. "Howell," Carter began, his voice oozing with false confidence. "Everything's under control here. The foundation is almost complete. We'll be back on schedule by the end of the week." On the other end, Howell didn't sound convinced. "Carter, we've poured a lot of money into this. If this project falters, I won't just be pulling my funds. I'll make sure you never get another contract in this city again." Carter gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the phone. "Trust me, Howell, this is going to be the most profitable development you've ever seen. We're already negotiating with buyers for the luxury apartments. It's a done deal." "Let's hope so," Howell replied coldly before ending the call. Slamming the phone down, Carter paced the office, muttering to himself, "Damn bureaucrats and their permits. If we could just get past this red tape." He grabbed a folder from his desk, documents outlining the development plans, and flipped through them. His frustration grew as he saw the pending permits and land registration issues flagged by his legal team. He waved the folder at his assistant, a young man named Todd, who stood nervously by the door. "Why is this still a problem?" Carter demanded. "I told you to handle the land deed issues weeks ago." Todd stammered, "We've submitted all the paperwork, but the city says there are inconsistencies in the ownership records. Something about overlapping claims." "Overlapping claims?" Carter nearly shouted. "The land is mine. I bought it fair and square." Todd swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Actually, sir, you leased it. The purchase was never finalized because—" Carter cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I don't care about the details. Fix it. Call whoever you need to call. I'm not letting some bureaucratic nonsense ruin this deal." Todd nodded quickly and scurried out, leaving Carter alone with his thoughts. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from the decanter on his desk and took a long sip, trying to calm his nerves. He wasn't a man used to losing, and he wasn't about to start now. Still, there was an unease creeping into his chest. He had always prided himself on being one step ahead, but lately it felt like he was stumbling blindly into a trap he couldn't see. Meanwhile, outside the trailer, the workers continued to labor under the harsh sun. Eric, the young worker who had questioned James's firing earlier, glanced toward the gate where James had walked away. "Something's not right," he muttered to another worker during their lunch break. "You saw how calm he was. It's like he knew something we didn't." The other worker shrugged. "What does it matter? Carter's the one calling the shots here. If you're smart, you'll keep your head down and do your job." But Eric couldn't shake the feeling. As he chewed on his sandwich, he made a silent promise to himself to find out more about James. There was something about the man that didn't add up, and Eric wasn't the kind to ignore his instincts. Back inside, Carter lit a cigar and leaned back in his chair, staring at the blueprints on the wall. The project was his ticket to greater power and wealth, and he wasn't going to let anyone or anything stand in his way. Little did he know, the very foundation of his plans was about to crumble beneath him. James parked his truck in the driveway of a modest yet well-kept house on the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood was quiet, with kids playing on bikes and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. As he stepped out, a young woman emerged from the porch. She was his niece, Olivia, a sharp and determined law student who often helped James with legal matters. Her arms were crossed and she had a smirk on her face. "So," Olivia said as he approached, "did he take the bait?" James chuckled softly. "Hook, line, and sinker. Carter didn't even bother to hear me out. Fired me on the spot." Olivia shook her head in disbelief. "Typical. Men like him think they're untouchable. But we've got everything lined up, right? The paperwork, the city approvals, nothing can go wrong now." James nodded. "Everything's ready. But we're not rushing this. Carter's arrogance will be his downfall. Let him keep building. The higher he climbs, the harder he'll fall." They walked into the house, where a small table in the living room was covered with documents, maps, and property records. Olivia picked up one of the older papers, its edges yellowed with age. "It's crazy to think your grandfather worked his whole life just to hold on to this land," she said, her voice softening. "And now it's ours." James sat down and ran his fingers over the document, his face thoughtful. "This land is more than just dirt, Olivia. It's history. It's sacrifice. My grandfather nearly lost it during the Depression, but he fought tooth and nail to keep it. It's been in our family for generations, and I'm not letting someone like Carter destroy that legacy for a few dollars." Olivia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "And he won't. Not with the evidence we have. Once this goes public, Carter's empire will crumble. No one will trust him again." James leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Carter thinks I'm just some guy he can push around. He doesn't even know he's trespassing on my land. But when the time comes, he'll know, and he'll regret every word he said." They spent the evening reviewing their plan, going over every detail to ensure there were no loose ends. Olivia double-checked the land deeds, zoning permits, and letters from the city confirming James's ownership. She had a knack for spotting inconsistencies, and she wanted to make sure their case was airtight. As the hours passed, James stood and looked out the window. The night was calm, the kind of quiet that carried an air of inevitability. "Carter's holding his groundbreaking ceremony soon," James said, his voice low. "That's when we make our move. Let him have his moment in the spotlight. He doesn't realize the ground he's standing on is already slipping out from under him." Olivia nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Let him dig his own grave. We'll just be there to watch." Outside, the moon cast a soft glow over the neighborhood. James stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air. He knew patience was key, and he was willing to wait as long as it took. Carter had fired him thinking he was disposable, a man with no power. But James had a plan, and soon Carter would learn the hard way that not all battles are fought with brute force. Sometimes the quiet ones held the real power. The construction site was buzzing with activity. Carter stood at the center of it all, shouting orders and directing his team with the bravado of a man who believed he had already won. The sounds of machinery roared around him, and the foundation of the luxury development was beginning to take shape. To anyone passing by, the project looked like it was well on its way to completion. To Carter, it was proof of his brilliance and determination. His assistant, Todd, approached cautiously, holding a clipboard and looking nervous as always. "Mr. Carter," he began, clearing his throat, "I've got an update on the land permits. The city office called again about the ownership records. They're saying there's still—" Carter waved him off, his irritation flaring instantly. "Enough with the permits, Todd. I told you to handle it. I don't have time for this nonsense." "But, sir," Todd pressed, his voice quieter, "they're saying there might be a legal issue with—" Carter turned to him, his face red with frustration. "Do you know how much money is riding on this project? Investors, buyers, the media, they're all watching. I don't care what the city says. We've come too far to stop now." Todd hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, knowing better than to argue further. Carter returned to barking orders, dismissing the concerns as trivial. In his mind, paperwork and legalities were mere formalities, things that could be smoothed over with the right connections or a generous payment. He prided himself on being a man of action. someone who bulldozed through obstacles rather than wasting time on bureaucracy. That evening, Carter held a private meeting with some of his top investors at a swanky downtown restaurant. Over expensive steaks and fine wine, he painted a picture of success. "Gentlemen," he began, raising his glass, "we're on the verge of something monumental. By this time next year, this development will be the crown jewel of the city. Luxury apartments, high-end retail, it's a gold mine." The investors nodded and murmured their approval, though a few exchanged skeptical glances. One of them, an older man named Mr. Davis, leaned forward. "Carter, we've heard whispers about issues with the land. Something about the ownership not being clear." Carter chuckled, waving the concern away as if it were a fly. "Ah, you know how these things are, Davis. Bureaucrats and their paperwork. It's all under control. By the time we cut the ribbon on this project, no one will remember there was ever an issue." The room filled with polite laughter, but Davis didn't seem convinced. Still, he said nothing further, deciding to keep a close eye on the situation. As Carter basked in the admiration of his investors, the cracks in his empire were already beginning to form. Back at the construction site, a junior worker discovered another letter from the city tucked into a stack of ignored paperwork. The letter highlighted the unresolved ownership claim, warning that construction might face legal repercussions if the matter wasn't addressed immediately. The worker handed it to Todd, who stared at it with growing unease. Todd thought about bringing it to Carter but hesitated. He had seen how the boss handled bad news. Carter didn't want problems. He wanted solutions that didn't require him to acknowledge his mistakes. Sighing, Todd slid the letter into a drawer, hoping that somehow it wouldn't come back to haunt them. Meanwhile, Carter drove home that night feeling invincible. In his mind, James was long forgotten, a blip on his radar, a man who had no significance in the grand scheme of things. He poured himself a drink, leaned back in his leather chair, and smirked at the thought of the groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for the following week. It would be a grand event, with cameras flashing and local officials shaking his hand. He envisioned the headlines, "Carter's Vision Transforms the City." But what Carter didn't realize was that his vision rested on borrowed ground, and the man he dismissed as insignificant was about to pull the rug out from under him. James sat at his kitchen table, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the stacks of papers in front of him. It was late, and the quiet of the house seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Olivia was seated across from him, flipping through a folder of documents. Her sharp eyes scanned every line, every clause, as if searching for even the slightest imperfection. "Everything's in order," Olivia said finally, setting the folder down with a satisfied nod. "The city's acknowledgement of your ownership is airtight. There's no way Carter can contest this, not legally." James nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the old deed that had belonged to his grandfather. It was more than just a piece of paper to him. It was a testament to the resilience of his family. They had fought hard to keep this land, through recessions, bad harvests, and attempts by wealthier men to buy it out from under them. Now, that legacy rested on his shoulders. "It's not just about stopping Carter," James said, his voice low but firm. "It's about making sure people like him think twice before they trample over someone else for their own gain. He didn't even look at me when he fired me. To him, I was just another body he could replace." Olivia leaned forward, her tone serious. "He won't see it coming, Uncle James. Right now, he's planning his big moment, thinking he's untouchable. When the truth comes out, it'll hit him where it hurts most, in his pride and his pocket. James allowed himself a small smile. He admired Olivia's fire, her determination. It reminded him of his younger days, when he had to fight tooth and nail to carve out a place for himself in a world that often dismissed him before he even spoke. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about setting things right. As the night stretched on, they reviewed their plans again, ensuring every step was perfectly aligned. James had already reached out to city officials and confirmed the necessary legal actions. The media had been tipped off, but with strict instructions to hold back the story until the right moment. Timing was everything, and James was determined to let Carter dig his own grave before stepping in. The next morning, James rose early, as he always did, and drove out to the construction site. He parked a little distance away and stood by the roadside, watching as workers moved about like ants, hauling materials and operating heavy machinery. Carter's voice carried across the site, barking orders with the same arrogance James remembered. James's presence didn't go unnoticed. Eric, the young worker who had always felt something was off about James's firing, spotted him from a distance. During a break, Eric approached cautiously, wiping sweat from his brow. "Hey, James," he said, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "What are you doing here? Thought Carter ran you off." James smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "Just checking on things. Old habits, I guess." Eric frowned, sensing there was more to James's visit than he was letting on. "You don't seem like the kind of guy to come back just to look around. Is there something going on?" James didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked out over the site, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes, Eric," he said after a moment, "things aren't always what they seem. Remember that." Eric blinked, unsure of what to make of the comment, but before he could press further, James patted him on the shoulder and walked back to his truck. As he drove away, Eric stood there, watching the truck disappear down the road, a nagging feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. Something was coming. He didn't know what, but he was sure it wasn't going to end well for Carter. Meanwhile, Carter stood at the center of the site, surveying his so-called empire. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he imagined the headlines from the upcoming groundbreaking ceremony. In his mind, the project was already a success, and James was nothing more than a distant memory. What he didn't realize was that the very ground he stood on had already begun to shift, and the man he dismissed was about to turn his world upside down. The day of the groundbreaking ceremony arrived with bright sunshine and a crisp breeze that carried the promise of success, or so Carter believed. The construction site had been transformed into a spectacle. Red and white banners fluttered in the wind. A podium had been set up near the foundation, and rows of folding chairs faced the stage. Local officials, investors, reporters, and even a few community members gathered, their chatter filling the air with anticipation. Carter stood near the podium, shaking hands with city officials and exchanging pleasantries with his investors. He was dressed impeccably, his polished shoes gleaming under the sunlight. A cigar rested in the corner of his mouth, unlit but present, his signature move when he wanted to exude confidence. "Today marks the beginning of something extraordinary," he told one of his guests. "This project is going to redefine the skyline of this city." The investors seemed impressed, nodding and murmuring their approval. Carter's smile widened as he turned to wave at the media, who were setting up cameras to capture his big moment. He felt untouchable. All the doubts and delays from the past few weeks had faded into the background, and he was ready to take center stage. Todd, however, looked far less confident. Standing a few feet behind Carter, clutching a clipboard, he kept glancing at his phone, his forehead damp with sweat. The city had sent yet another notice that morning, reiterating unresolved ownership claims over the land. He had considered showing it to Carter but decided against it. The boss wouldn't want anything disrupting his day of triumph, and Todd didn't want to be the one to face his wrath. Still, the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. As the ceremony began, Carter took to the podium with a swagger that bordered on arrogance. He delivered a rousing speech about progress, innovation, and the future of the city, peppered with just enough buzzwords to keep the crowd engaged. He thanked his investors for their trust, praised his team for their hard work, and promised that the project would bring unmatched value to the community. Applause erupted as Carter stepped back and gestured towards the ceremonial shovel, painted gold and resting in a mound of fresh dirt. A row of hard hats lined a table nearby, and a group of officials and investors joined Carter as they prepared for the symbolic breaking of ground. But just as Carter reached for the shovel, a voice from the back of the crowd rang out, firm and clear. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." All heads turned to see James standing at the edge of the gathering, dressed in a clean, pressed shirt and jeans, holding a thick folder under his arm. His presence was commanding, and despite his simple attire, there was an undeniable air of authority about him. Carter's confident smile faltered as he recognized the man he had fired just days earlier. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "This is a private event." James stepped forward, his steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted as he approached, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected interruption. When he reached the podium, he stopped and looked directly at Carter, his expression calm but unyielding. "I'm here to save you from making an even bigger fool of yourself," James said, his tone even but laced with quiet power. He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "This," he said, holding them up for the crowd to see, "is a deed to this land. My land." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd as reporters began snapping photos and scribbling notes. Carter's face turned red, a mix of anger and disbelief. "What kind of stunt is this?" he growled. "You think you can just show up here and—" James cut him off, his voice firm. "This isn't a stunt. This is the truth. I've owned this land for years, long before you dreamed of turning it into your so-called masterpiece." He handed the papers to a city official standing nearby, who began examining them with a frown. "These documents are legitimate," the official confirmed after a tense moment. "Mr. Daniels is the rightful owner of this property." The crowd gasped and the murmurs grew louder. Carter froze, his mind racing as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He turned to Todd, who looked pale and defeated. "You knew about this?" Carter hissed, his voice low and venomous. Todd stammered, I tried to tell you." James, ignoring the exchange, addressed the crowd. "I've let this go on long enough." Carter knew there were unresolved issues with this land, but he chose to ignore them. He built his plans on something that didn't belong to him, thinking no one would challenge him. Well, today that ends. The media swarmed James, shouting questions, but he remained focused. "I didn't come here to cause a scene. I came here to make things right. This land belongs to my family, and I'm not going to let anyone take it from us." Carter stood frozen at the podium, his grand plans unraveling before his eyes. The ground he had claimed as his foundation, both literally and figuratively, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The crowd was in chaos. Reporters shoved microphones toward James, their voices rising in a cacophony of questions. "Mr. Daniels, how long have you owned the land? Did you know about the development plans? What are your intentions now?" James held up a hand, signaling for silence, and the reporters quieted, sensing the authority in his gesture. "This land has been in my family for generations," James began, his voice steady. "My grandfather bought it during a time when people like us weren't given a fair shot. He worked the fields, raised his family here, and fought to keep it when others tried to take it away. I've honored that legacy by ensuring it stays in our hands." Carter's face was a storm of emotions, disbelief, anger, and panic swirling all at once. He stormed toward James, pointing an accusatory finger. "You can't just show up and derail this project. I've got investors, contracts. This is bigger than you." James didn't flinch. "What's bigger than me, Mr. Carter, is the truth. You ignored every warning, every legal notice, and chose to build on land you don't own. That's not just arrogance, that's recklessness." The city official who had reviewed the documents stepped forward, his voice cutting through the commotion. "I can confirm that Mr. Daniels is the rightful owner of this property. The development permits issued for this site are now invalid. All work must cease immediately until this matter is resolved." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Investors began turning on Carter, their whispered concerns now audible. "How could he let this happen?" one muttered. "Did he know about this all along?" another questioned. The cameras flashed, capturing Carter's humiliation in real time. Carter turned on Todd, his voice a low hiss. "Why didn't you fix this? I told you to handle the paperwork weeks ago." Todd's face was pale, his voice trembling. "I tried, sir, but you wouldn't listen. You said it was just red tape." James stepped forward again, commanding the crowd's attention. "This isn't about red tape. It's about respect. Respect for the people who built this community, for the families who've lived here for generations. You didn't care about any of that. All you saw was profit." The tension in the air was thick as Carter struggled to regain control. He turned to the investors, his tone desperate. "We can still work this out. There's always a way to negotiate." One of the investors, Mr. Davis, shook his head, his expression cold. "You've put us all at risk, Carter. This isn't just a minor oversight. It's a disaster. Our money, our reputations, they're all tied to this project. And you didn't even bother to check the foundation you were building on." Carter's desperation grew. "James," he said, turning to him now, his voice taking on a false note of humility. "Let's talk. We can work something out. I'll pay you double what the land is worth. Triple, even." James raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about money. It never was. This is about family, about history, about doing what's right." Carter opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, one of the reporters stepped forward, asking the question that was on everyone's mind. "Mr. Daniels, what are your plans for the land now?" James looked out over the site, his gaze thoughtful. "That," he said, his voice strong and deliberate, "will be revealed in due time. But I can tell you this, whatever happens here will be something that benefits the community, not just the pockets of a few men in suits." The crowd erupted into applause, a surprising show of support for James. Carter, on the other hand, looked like a man on the verge of collapse. The empire he had built on false confidence and ignored warnings was crumbling, and there was no salvaging it. As the city official stepped forward to officially halt the project, Carter's investors began filing out, their disappointment palpable. The media turned their attention back to James. hounding him with more questions, but he simply nodded and walked away, his work for the day done. For Carter, the ceremony had become a nightmare, a public spectacle of his failure. For James, it was the beginning of something new, a chance to honor his family's legacy and stand tall against those who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. The aftermath of the ceremony hit Carter like a storm he couldn't escape. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, he was back in his office, the once pristine trailer now a mess of overturned papers, coffee-stained blueprints, and shattered confidence. He sat at his desk, gripping the edge so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The weight of the day's events bore down on him, heavier than he could bear. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, but he ignored them. He already knew what they would say: investors pulling out, media headlines ridiculing him, and the city officials demanding explanations. The once bustling construction site outside his window was eerily silent now, the machinery halted and the workers gone. Even Todd, who had always been a nervous but loyal presence, had slipped away quietly, not wanting to face Carter's wrath any longer. The news was everywhere. Headlines like "Local Developer Embroiled in Land Ownership Scandal" and "Construction Boss Ignores Legal Warnings, Faces Public Humiliation" flashed across every screen. Carter turned off the small television in his office, unable to watch another second of his downfall being dissected for public entertainment. A knock at the door startled him. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but the persistent sound grew louder. Finally, he barked, "Come in." His voice was hoarse, his usual commanding tone reduced to a growl. The door creaked open, and Mr. Davis, one of the most influential investors in the project, stepped inside. Carter stood, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "Davis," he began, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I was just about to call you." Davis raised a hand, silencing him. His expression was stony, his disappointment evident. "Don't bother, Carter. I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to tell you that our partnership is over." Carter's forced smile faltered. "Over? Davis, we've worked together for years. This is just a hiccup, a misunderstanding that can be fixed." Davis crossed his arms, his gaze unrelenting. "A misunderstanding? You built an entire project on land you didn't even own. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? The media is having a field day, and I've already lost several potential clients because of this mess." Carter opened his mouth to argue, but Davis cut him off. "I'm pulling my funding, as are most of the others. And let me make this clear. You won't get another penny from anyone in this city. Your reputation is finished, Carter." The words hit harder than any blow. Carter slumped back into his chair, his confidence crumbling. "There has to be something I can do," he muttered, more to himself than to Davis. But Davis wasn't interested in his self-pity. "You had your chance," he said coldly. "Now you're on your own." Without another word, he turned and left, leaving Carter alone in the suffocating silence of his office. As the night wore on, Carter sat in the dim light, staring blankly at the blueprints on his desk. The lines and numbers that once represented his future now seemed meaningless. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling in his unsteady hand. His mind raced, searching for a way out of the mess he had created, but every avenue seemed blocked. His thoughts kept circling back to James. The quiet, unassuming man he had dismissed without a second thought had dismantled his empire with a single piece of paper. Carter couldn't understand it, how someone he considered beneath him had managed to outsmart him so completely. The realization stung worse than the headlines or the investor's betrayal. For the first time in his career, Carter felt powerless. The man who had always prided himself on being untouchable now sat in the ruins of his own arrogance, the foundation of his success shattered. And as the night stretched into morning, Carter realized that the battle was over, and he had lost. While Carter's world fell apart, James's focus remained steady. The following morning, he sat on the porch of his home, a cup of coffee in hand, as Olivia joined him with a stack of freshly printed documents. She handed them over with a satisfied smile. "The press is already spinning it your way. They're calling you the man who stood against the system. You're a hit." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I didn't do this for headlines. This was never about attention or making a statement. It was about protecting what's ours." Olivia sat beside him, her expression serious now. "I know, Uncle James, but the attention works in our favor. The community is rallying behind you. People are tired of men like Carter exploiting the city for their gain. They're looking to you now." James nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of his coffee. He had always been a man of action, not words, but he understood the weight of the moment. His quiet life had been disrupted, and now he stood at the center of a movement he hadn't planned for but couldn't ignore. Later that day, James visited the city hall to finalize his next steps. The city officials, previously wary of Carter's influence, now treated James with respect and gratitude. He was greeted by the head of urban planning, a middle-aged woman named Miss Rosario, who extended her hand warmly. "Mr. Daniels," she said, "on behalf of the city, I want to thank you for bringing this issue to light. Developers like Carter have been cutting corners for years, and this situation has forced us to reevaluate how we handle permits and land ownership." James shook her hand firmly. "I appreciate that, Miss Rosario, but my focus isn't on the past, it's on what happens next." Together, they reviewed plans for the land. James had been quietly working on a proposal with Olivia and a few trusted community members. His vision was clear. The land would not become a luxury development for the wealthy, but a space that served the people. "We're proposing affordable housing units," James explained, pointing to a sketch Olivia had prepared. "Not just cookie-cutter apartments, but homes where families can build lives. Alongside that, a community center, something my grandfather always dreamed of, a place where kids can learn, play, and grow." Miss Rosario smiled, clearly impressed. "This is exactly what the city needs, and given the public support you've gained, I don't think you'll have any trouble getting this approved." As the meeting ended, James felt a sense of pride and purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still logistical hurdles to overcome, funding to secure, and designs to finalize. But he was ready. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was his. It was about creating something bigger, something lasting. That evening, James stood on the edge of his land, looking out over the quiet construction site. The machinery sat idle, the once bustling hub now eerily still. He could still see the scars in the earth where Carter's crew had begun laying the foundation for their high-rise buildings. But soon, those scars would heal, and something new, something meaningful, would take their place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the land, James felt a deep sense of peace. He had fought for his family's legacy and won. Now it was time to build a future worthy of the sacrifices that had come before him. In a small, dimly lit office at the edge of town, Carter sat slumped in a chair that once symbolized his authority. His suit, once pristine, was wrinkled, and the cigar he usually held with pride now lay unlit on the desk. The room smelled of stale whiskey and failure. He had spent the last few days in a fog, avoiding the phone calls he knew would bring more bad news. Most of his investors had cut ties, his legal team had all but abandoned him, and the media had turned him into a laughingstock. But Carter wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. His desperation drove him to make one last attempt to salvage what he could. Picking up his phone with a trembling hand, he dialed James's number. He had obtained it through the site foreman, who, unlike everyone else, still answered Carter's calls. The line rang twice before James picked up. "This is James," came the calm, familiar voice. Carter hesitated for a moment, swallowing his pride, before forcing himself to speak. "James, it's Carter." The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably, and Carter could feel the weight of James's pause. Finally, James replied, his voice steady. "What do you want, Carter?" Carter cleared his throat, trying to sound more composed. "I wanted to talk. I think we can still work something out. You don't have to go through with whatever it is you're planning." James's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "And what exactly are you offering, Carter? More empty promises? Another deal built on lies?" Carter bristled at the accusation, but quickly forced himself to soften his tone. "I'll pay you, James. Name your price. Whatever the land is worth, I'll double it, triple it, if that's what it takes." James let out a soft chuckle, the sound devoid of humor. "You think this is about money? Carter, you've already taken enough from people like me. You had your chance to do the right thing, and you blew it." "I made a mistake," Carter said quickly, his voice rising with desperation. "But I can fix this. Just give me a chance." James's reply was firm, unyielding. "This isn't a mistake you can fix with money, Carter. You didn't just try to take land. You disrespected the people who built this community, who worked hard to hold on to what little they had. This isn't about you anymore." Carter's grip tightened on the phone, his frustration boiling over. "So that's it? You're just going to destroy everything I've built?" James's voice, calm and resolute, delivered the final blow. "You destroyed yourself, Carter. Now you're just seeing the consequences." The call ended with a click, leaving Carter staring at the phone in stunned silence. For the first time, he realized there was no way out, no quick fix to undo the damage he had caused. He had lost everything. His investors, his reputation, and now even the illusion of control. That night, Carter wandered the empty halls of his once thriving office building. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the bustling energy it once held. Framed photos of his past achievements lined the walls, but now they felt like relics of another life, a life he had taken for granted. As he stared out the window, looking at the darkened city skyline, Carter finally understood the depth of his failure. He had built his empire on arrogance, greed, and the belief that he could trample over anyone who got in his way. But James had shown him otherwise. The land he had dismissed as just another business transaction had turned into the foundation of his downfall. For the first time in years, Carter felt small, insignificant in a world he once thought he controlled. And as the night stretched on, he realized that no amount of money, power, or persuasion could undo the damage. The empire he had built was gone, and all that remained was the man he had become, a shadow of his former self. As the sun rose over the now quiet construction site, James stood at the edge of the land, watching the golden light spill across the barren soil. It wasn't a view of defeat, it was one of hope. The scarred earth, once meant for towering luxury apartments, now held the promise of something far greater. Beside him stood Olivia, a clipboard in her hand and determination in her eyes. She had spent the last few days working tirelessly, coordinating with city officials, architects, and community leaders. Their plan was no longer just an idea. It was becoming a movement. "This is the start of something bigger," Olivia said, breaking the silence. "The city's already on board with the housing and community center. We're getting offers from nonprofits and local organizations to help with funding." James nodded, his hands resting in his pockets as he surveyed the land. "It's not just about building homes," he said. "It's about building trust, giving people a place where they feel they belong, a place where they can grow." He turned to Olivia, his expression serious. "This has to be done right. No cutting corners, no rushing. Every detail matters." Olivia smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you." Over the next few weeks, the transformation began. The first step was clearing the remnants of Carter's failed project. The massive machinery was removed, and the skeletal foundations were dismantled. James made it a point to hire local workers for the job, offering fair wages and opportunities to those who had been overlooked or exploited by people like Carter. The media continued to cover the story, but this time the narrative shifted. James was no longer just the man who stood up to a greedy developer. He was now a symbol of resilience and leadership. Community members began showing up to volunteer their time, bringing tools, supplies, and enthusiasm. What had once been a desolate construction site became a hub of activity, filled with laughter, determination, and hope. One afternoon, as James worked alongside the volunteers, Eric, the young worker from Carter's crew, approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Daniels," he began, wiping his hands nervously on his jeans. I just wanted to say thank you for everything." James paused, looking up from the beam he was helping to carry. "You don't owe me any thanks, Eric. You're part of this now. We're all building this together." Eric nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. "Still, it means a lot. Working for Carter, it always felt like we didn't matter, like we were just tools to get the job done. But here, it's different." James patted him on the shoulder. "That's because it is different. This isn't just about building structures. It's about building people up." The sense of community continued to grow. Families who had been displaced or struggling financially came forward, eager to reserve spots in the housing development. A local nonprofit partnered with James to provide free workshops on financial literacy and job skills, ensuring that the residents wouldn't just have a roof over their heads, but a foundation for a better future. As the weeks turned into months, the land began to transform. The skeletal beginnings of homes took shape, their frames rising steadily against the horizon. In the center of the site, construction began on the community center, a bright and open space designed for learning, gathering, and growth. James often walked the site in the evenings, taking in the progress and reflecting on how far they had come. One evening, he stopped by the old oak tree near the entrance, the same spot where he had parked his truck after being fired. The memory felt distant now, like a faint echo of a life he had left behind. Olivia joined him, holding a blueprint in her hands. "The first phase of homes will be ready by spring," she said, "and the community center should be done by summer. We're on track." James smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good. That's how it should be." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their work settling comfortably between them. James knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face, obstacles to overcome, but for now, he allowed himself to feel the satisfaction of knowing that they were building something real, something that mattered. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in a warm, golden glow, James knew they had created more than just a new beginning. They had created a legacy. By spring, the transformation of the land was nearly complete. Rows of homes stood proudly under the bright sky, their vibrant colors reflecting the life and hope they represented. Each house was unique, designed with care to suit the needs of the families who would soon call them home. The community center, a modern yet welcoming structure, stood at the heart of it all, a symbol of unity and progress. The grand opening was set for a Saturday morning, and the excitement in the air was palpable. Families who had been waiting months for this day began gathering early, bringing their children and neighbors to celebrate. Food stalls lined the street, music played from a local band, and laughter filled the air. James arrived quietly, as he always did, preferring to observe the joy around him rather than take the spotlight. Olivia, however, wouldn't let him stay in the background for long. "Uncle James," she called, waving him toward the stage where a small podium had been set up. "They're waiting for you." James sighed, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You know I'm not much for speeches." Olivia smirked. "And yet, here you are, the man of the hour. They need to hear from you. This is your moment." Reluctantly, James made his way to the stage. As he stepped up to the podium, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. He looked out over the sea of faces, families, workers, community leaders, all gathered to celebrate the realization of a dream that had started as a fight to reclaim what was rightfully his. When the applause died down, James began to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This land has seen a lot," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words sink in. "It's seen struggle, it's seen sacrifice, and for a time it seemed like it might lose its meaning, its purpose." He glanced at Olivia, who stood proudly among the crowd, then continued, "But today, we're here to celebrate not just what we've built, but what we've reclaimed. This isn't just a place to live. It's a place to grow, to dream, to build a future. It's a reminder that no matter how hard things get, no matter who tries to take what's ours, we have the strength to stand together and fight for what matters." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, and James stepped back, letting their energy wash over him. As he descended from the stage, a young boy ran up to him, his face beaming with excitement. "Mr. Daniels," the boy called out, tugging on his sleeve, "thank you for my new house." James knelt down to the boy's level, his smile genuine and warm. "You're welcome, son. But remember, this isn't just your house, it's your home. Take care of it, and it'll take care of you." The boy nodded solemnly before running off to join his friends, leaving James to watch him with a sense of quiet pride. This was why he had fought so hard. Not for the headlines or the recognition, but for moments like this. As the festivities continued, James took a moment to step back and observe. The land, once scarred and lifeless, was now teeming with life. Children played in the yards, families shared meals and laughter, and the community center buzzed with activity as people signed up for classes and programs. Eric, the young worker who had questioned Carter's decisions, approached James with a wide grin. "It's something else, isn't it?" he said, gesturing to the bustling scene around them. James nodded, his eyes taking it all in. "It's more than I ever imagined," he admitted. "But it's not about me. It's about them. It's about us." Eric smiled, clearly inspired. "You've done something incredible here, Mr. Daniels. You've given people hope." James placed a hand on Eric's shoulder. "Hope is something we all have to carry, Eric. It's not just mine to give, it's ours to share." As the sun began to set, casting the community in a warm, golden light, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight had been long and difficult, but the reward was more than worth it. Together, they had turned a symbol of greed and exploitation into a beacon of hope and unity. For James, this wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And as he looked out over the community he had helped build, he knew that the best was yet to come. As the months passed, the community James and Olivia had built continued to thrive. The homes were filled with families, each one contributing to the growth of their new neighborhood. The community center became a hub of activity, offering everything from after-school programs for children and to workshops on entrepreneurship and gardening for adults. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a place to grow, learn, and connect. James, though content with the progress, knew the work wasn't over. There were still challenges to face, ensuring the sustainability of the housing project, securing long-term funding for community programs, and expanding the initiatives that had started to take root. But he was no longer the man who had quietly endured hardships. He was now a leader, a beacon for others who believed in what he believed, that hard work, resilience, and unity could overcome any obstacle. One afternoon, as James sat in the community center with Olivia, reviewing the latest plans for future housing developments, there was a knock on the door. Olivia looked up, raising an eyebrow as she motioned for the visitor to come in. To their surprise, it was one of the city's top council members, Mr. Richards, a man who had been somewhat distant during the early days of the project. His presence here, unannounced, caught both of them off guard. "Mr. Daniels, Miss Olivia," Mr. Richards said, offering a hand to each of them as he walked into the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Olivia replied, shaking his hand. "What brings you by today?" James leaned back in his chair, curious. "Is everything all right, Mr. Richards?" Richards nodded, but there was a thoughtful expression on his face. "I wanted to speak to you both about something important, something that's been on my mind for a while now." He paused before continuing, looking at James. "This project you've built here, it's more than just a success. It's a model for what the city needs. And I've been speaking with the mayor about ways we can officially recognize your work. Not just for your efforts here, but for everything you've done for the community." James exchanged a glance with Olivia, not quite understanding where this was headed. "I'm not in it for recognition, Mr. Richards," James said humbly. "I just wanted to make sure families had a chance at something better." Richards smiled, clearly impressed by James's modesty. "I understand that. But this isn't just about recognition for you. It's about honoring what you've done for the city. We're putting together a proposal to designate this neighborhood as a permanent community initiative, and we want to name it after you. A legacy for your work, for your family's history. We want this to be a place that represents resilience, leadership, and unity for generations to come." James was taken aback, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't one for accolades or titles, and the idea of having an entire community named after him felt overwhelming. But as he looked at Olivia's face, the pride and support in her eyes, he felt a sense of calm. "James," Olivia said gently, "this is a huge honor. Your work here will always be remembered. This community, this place, it's built on your values. It belongs to everyone who's been a part of it." James sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on everything that had brought him here, the challenges, the sacrifices, the battles. But he realized that it wasn't about him. It had never been. It was about the people who stood by him, who fought with him, and who had believed in the vision from the start. "I'm honored," James finally said, his voice steady. "But this isn't about my name. It's about this community, about the families who've made it what it is. I'll accept the honor, but it's not mine alone. This belongs to everyone." Richards nodded, understanding. "Of course. It's a tribute to all of you." As the meeting wrapped up, James stood and shook Mr. Richards' hand, his mind swirling with thoughts of the future. There was still so much to do, but now it was clear that the impact of their work would last far beyond his own lifetime. That evening, James walked to the community center with Olivia, the sun setting behind them. They watched as families gathered, the laughter of children echoing in the air. The neighborhood was thriving, the dreams of so many people coming to life. "You did it, Uncle James," Olivia said, her voice full of admiration. James looked around at the bustling, vibrant community. The homes, the people, the future taking shape before his eyes. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything they had accomplished. "No," he said softly, "we did it." And as he watched a group of children playing near the swings, he knew that the legacy they had built here would not only stand the test of time, it would inspire others for generations to come. Years passed, and the once barren land that had been at the center of the fight was now a flourishing neighborhood filled with life, laughter, and hope. The community center had expanded, adding classrooms, a library, and even a small theater where local artists could perform. The housing units were no longer just homes. They were places where generations were raised, dreams were nurtured, and bonds were forged. James, now older, found himself spending most of his days at the community center, mentoring young people who looked up to him as a father figure. He never sought out recognition, but to the community he was a legend, a living reminder of what could be accomplished with determination, humility, and integrity. One afternoon, James sat on a bench beneath the old oak tree near the entrance to the community, watching as children played in the park. A young boy, no older than 10, ran up to him with a sketch pad in hand. "Mr. Daniels," the boy called, his face beaming with excitement. "Look what I drew." James leaned down to look at the boy's sketch. It was a drawing of the community center, complete with smiling stick figures of people working together. At the top, in large, uneven letters, the boy had written, "James Daniels Community Center, a place for everyone." James chuckled softly, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's a fine piece of art, young man. You've got quite the talent." "Thanks," the boy said, his grin widening. "My mom said you're the reason we have this place. Is that true?" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "I might have helped a little," he said with a gentle smile. "But the real reason this place is here is because people came together. We worked as a team, and we didn't give up, even when it got tough." The boy tilted his head, thinking about James's words. "I want to do that too when I grow up. I want to help people." James nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "You can, son. All it takes is kindness, hard work, and a little bit of courage." As the boy ran off to join his friends, James leaned back against the bench, watching the vibrant community unfold before him. He thought about his grandfather, who had fought so hard to keep the land, and about the people who had stood by him during the hardest days of his battle with Carter. They were all a part of this. this living, breathing testament to what could be achieved when people came together for a greater purpose. Olivia joined him a few moments later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to James and sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "I was going through some old files this morning," she said, "and I found the blueprint we made when we first started. Do you remember how small it was? Just a few houses and a tiny community hall?" James chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "I remember thinking it was more than we'd ever managed to build. Funny how things turn out." Olivia smiled. "We did good, Uncle James. This place, it's everything we dreamed of and more." James nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the setting sun bathed the neighborhood in golden light. "It's not about what we built," he said after a moment. "It's about the people who live here. This isn't just a place, it's a lesson. A reminder that no matter how hard things get, we can always fight for what's right. And when we do, we can build something that lasts." The two of them sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the bustling community filling the air around them. For James, this was more than just the end of a journey. It was the fulfillment of a promise, the continuation of a legacy, and the start of something far greater than himself. As the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, James stood, his movements slower but steady. He looked out over the neighborhood one last time before turning to Olivia. "Let's head inside," he said. "There's still work to do." And with that, James walked back toward the community center, knowing that his legacy wasn't just in the buildings or the land. It was in the people, the values, and the lessons that would endure long after he was gone. The story of James and Carter is a powerful reminder of the values that truly matter in life: integrity, humility, and respect. At its core, this narrative teaches us that the way we treat others, especially those we perceive as powerless, speaks volumes about our character. Carter's downfall wasn't just a result of his poor business decisions. It stemmed from his arrogance and disregard for the dignity of others. He saw James as disposable, a mere worker in his grand plans, and that blindness cost him everything. James, on the other hand, exemplified quiet strength and perseverance. He could have sought revenge or acted out in anger when wronged, but instead he chose to stand his ground with dignity. His actions weren't motivated by selfish gain or a desire for power, but by a deep respect for his family's legacy and a commitment to doing what was right. This contrast between the two characters shows that true power doesn't come from wealth or status, but from principles, patience, and purpose. The story also emphasizes the importance of community and unity. James didn't just fight for himself. He fought for the people who would benefit from his land. By transforming what could have been another profit-driven development into a space for growth, education, and opportunity, he created something that would outlast him and inspire generations to come. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Never underestimate the value of doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. Treat everyone with respect, regardless of their position or background, because you never know the battles they fought or the potential they hold. And finally, remember that true success isn't measured by how much you gain, but by how much you give back to others and the legacy you leave behind.